In the green, mountainous hills where the Angami tribe had lived for generations, there were two inseparable young men, Kechü and Tepu. Since their childhood, their friendship had blossomed like the wildflowers that covered the fields in spring. Although their families had differences in their worldview, the two young men found in their relationship a connection that seemed stronger than any blood ties or tribal traditions. Kechü, the son of a peaceful farmer, had been raised to respect the land and live together. His family valued harmony between the tribe and nature, and his days were spent working in the fields and being taught by his father, who spoke to him about the importance of avoiding conflict at all costs. He was a calm young man with an analytical mind and a heart full of empathy. Since childhood, he had shown great curiosity about the stories of his people, especially those that spoke of unity and cooperation between tribes. On the other hand, Tepu came from a family of warriors. His father, a renowned fighter, had always stressed the importance of strength and preparation for conflict. "The world is a hostile place," his father would often tell him, "and if we are not ready to defend ourselves, we will not survive." Although Tepu admired his family's bravery and courage, his spirit was different. Despite having been trained in the use of the spear and sword from an early age, he always felt that true strength lay in his ability to understand others, rather than imposing his will with violence. Despite these family differences, Kechü and Tepu bonded over their daily adventures. They spent their days running through the woods, exploring rivers and climbing hills. The bond they shared was something special, a pure and sincere friendship that separated them from the divisions that often plagued adults. In the children's eyes, the world was not divided into friends and enemies, but into partners in adventure and endless possibilities. One of their favorite activities was to sit under the great tree that stood in the center of their village, a symbol of wisdom and longevity for the Angami. There they would spend hours talking about their dreams for the future. Kechü dreamed of a world where tribes lived in peace, sharing their knowledge and resources. Tepu, although aware of the dangers facing his tribe, shared his friend's desire to see a future where war was not necessary. "Do you think we will ever see all the tribes united, Kechü?" asked Tepu as he threw a stone into the river flowing nearby. Kechü, with a calm smile, replied, "If we want it enough, Tepu, then it can be. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday." That hope, that shared vision of a better future, strengthened their friendship. Although their parents and communities instilled different values in them, Kechü and Tepu found in their relationship an alternative, an example that differences could be overcome. Where adults saw old enmities, they saw opportunities to change things. However, as the years passed, stability in the region began to falter. Rumors of conflicts in nearby tribes reached the ears of the elders of the Angami tribe. Territorial tensions and old disputes that seemed to have been forgotten were rekindled with force. The adults began to speak in serious tones about the possibility of an imminent confrontation. The meetings of the tribal chiefs became more frequent and filled with concern. Despite these shadows that were beginning to fall over the region, Kechü and Tepu kept their friendship intact. But deep in their hearts, they both knew that the world was changing. Conversations between their families were becoming more tense, and the pressure to choose a side was beginning to appear. One afternoon, as the two of them walked through the fields, Tepu broke the silence that had accompanied them all day. "Kechü, my father says that we must prepare for war. The other tribes are seeking to expand their territories, and we cannot sit back and do nothing." Kechü stopped and stared at him, sensing the tension in his friend. "My father says otherwise, Tepu. He believes that war will only bring more suffering. He wants us to find a way to resolve this without fighting." Tepu, though he respected Kechü's words, couldn't help but feel caught between two worlds. "I don't know if that will be possible this time, Kechü. My family believes that we must fight to protect what is ours. We cannot allow our land to be taken from us." Silence settled between the two friends, but rather than dividing them, that moment of uncertainty only deepened their understanding of each other. They knew that the friendship they shared would be tested by the circumstances ahead, but they also knew that they weren't willing to give it up easily. With the handshake, the two young men sealed a silent pact. Whatever happened, their friendship would be stronger than any war. They would be, above all, brothers in spirit, ready to find a solution, even in the darkest moments. The seasons were changing, and with them, tension in the region was rising. Rumors of war were no longer just whispers among the elders, but an imminent reality. Neighboring tribes were on the brink of direct confrontation, and the Angami tribe, which had hitherto remained neutral, was being swept up in the tide of hostilities. Tribal leaders began meeting more frequently, discussing strategies, alliances, and the possible consequences of a war. In the midst of this growing storm, Kechü and Tepu continued to find moments to escape the worries of the adult world. However, these escapes were becoming shorter and shorter, and the weight of their responsibilities was beginning to show on their faces. One afternoon, as the two friends were walking through the forest, Kechü noticed that something had changed in Tepu. His friend was quieter than usual, and the lightness that had always characterized their conversations had vanished. "Kechü," Tepu said after a long silence, "my father told me that we will prepare for war. He says that the tribe cannot continue to stand on the sidelines, that if we do not take a firm stand, we will be seen as weak." Kechü frowned, feeling a pang of unease inside him. His own father had been talking about the need to find a peaceful solution, to avoid war at all costs. He knew that Tepu's family had a different view, but hearing those words from his friend's mouth affected him deeply. "We cannot resolve this with violence, Tepu," Kechü replied calmly, but with a firmness he had not shown before. "War will only bring more pain. My father believes we should sit down and talk, find a way to negotiate before it is too late." Tepu clenched his fists, not out of anger at his friend, but out of frustration at being caught between his family's beliefs and his own friendship. "I know, Kechü. I too want this to be resolved without a fight, but I'm not sure that's possible. My father and many others in the tribe are convinced that only force can protect us." Silence fell between them, but this time it was not a comfortable silence. It was a silence filled with uncertainty, with unasked questions and fears they both shared, but could not openly express. The following days only increased the distance between their families. The tribe's warriors began to train more intensely, and fortifications were erected on the borders of Angami territory. The air felt heavier, and Kechü and Tepu found themselves increasingly dragged down by the expectations of their respective families. One evening, while Kechü was having dinner with his family, his father, always peaceful and wise, spoke seriously. "War is coming closer and closer, Kechü. You must be prepared for whatever comes. But always remember what I have taught you. Violence is not the only solution. There are other ways to fight, ways that do not involve bloodshed." Kechü nodded, respecting his father's words, but he couldn't help but feel a growing anxiety. He knew that his family's beliefs did not match Tepu's, and he worried about what this would mean for their friendship. On the other hand, at Tepu's house, the atmosphere was completely different. His father, a man with a deep voice and an imposing presence, gave orders to the warriors, organizing patrols and training. "Tepu," he told him one night, "you must be ready to fight. We cannot allow the neighboring tribes to think that we are weak. Our strength is the only thing that keeps us safe." Tepu deeply respected his father, but every time he heard those words, his mind drifted back to his friendship with Kechü. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want the tribes to destroy each other over old territorial disputes. Yet the weight of his family's expectations made him feel trapped, as if he had no choice but to follow the path that had been laid out for him. As the days passed, the situation between the tribes became more tense. Small clashes at the borders began to occur more frequently. The young warriors of the Angami tribe, including Tepu, began to train more intensively, preparing for what seemed to be an inevitable war. Although they continued to see each other, Kechü and Tepu knew something had changed. The pressure from their families and tribe was growing stronger, and although their friendship was deep, they both felt that conflict was beginning to creep into their relationship. One afternoon, as they gathered under his favorite tree, Tepu finally spoke of what had been weighing on him for days. "Kechü," he said in a deep voice, "I don't know how much longer we can continue like this. My family is ready to fight. If war comes, I don't know if I can stay away from it." Kechü looked at him sadly. He knew Tepu was serious and he couldn't blame him. They were both caught between their families and their own worldview. "I don't want this to separate us, Tepu," Kechü replied in a voice that revealed his pain. "But I don't think war is the solution." Tepu looked down, unable to find an answer. He knew Kechü was right, but he also knew that his loyalty to his family would inevitably lead him to the battlefield if the situation continued to deteriorate. Before parting ways that afternoon, the two friends made an oath. No matter what, they would try to keep their friendship intact. They knew war was imminent, but they promised each other that they would not let the horrors of conflict tear them apart. "We are brothers, Kechü," Tepu said firmly, squeezing his friend's hand. "Nothing can change that." Kechü nodded, knowing that although their paths seemed to diverge, their bond was still the most important thing in their lives. But deep down, they both knew the world around them was rapidly darkening. War was about to break out, and while they hoped their friendship could survive, they also knew the forces they faced were powerful. The conflict, which had been a lurking threat, finally broke out. The war between the neighboring tribes was no longer just a rumor. It had become a violent reality, consuming the lands around the Angami tribe. Surprise attacks, ambushes on the roads, and skirmishes on the borders became part of everyday life. The region was plunged into a chaos that not even the wisest elders of the tribe had foreseen. The Angami tribe, which had tried to stay out of the conflict until the last moment, was dragged into the conflict when a rival tribe attacked their lands to control a crucial water source. This attack marked the point of no return. Angami warriors, including Tepu and his family, mobilized to protect their people. Kechü watched with sadness and concern as his tribe's warriors prepared for war. His father, a man of peace, continued to advocate a diplomatic solution, but even he understood that the situation was delicate. "Sometimes we cannot avoid the storm," he told Kechü one night as they looked out at the dark sky. "But we can decide how to face it." That same night, Tepu and the other warriors set out for the border to face the enemy attacks. Kechü had been with him before his departure, but there was little they could say to each other. They both knew that the war now separated them more tangibly than ever. "See you soon, friend," Tepu said with a tight smile, trying not to show the weight of what was coming. "Be careful, Tepu," Kechü replied. "I hope you don't have to fight." Tepu nodded, but deep down, he knew that a confrontation was inevitable. Days later, Kechü received news of the battle on the border. The Angami warriors had managed to repel the first attack of the rival tribe, but at a high cost. Several warriors had been killed, and others were wounded. Although Tepu was among the survivors, the losses weighed heavily on the entire tribe. Tepu's return to the village was not as they had imagined in their younger days, when they had fantasized about glorious victories and invincible heroes. Instead, what Tepu had seen in battle was the brutal reality of war, suffering, pain, and loss. The faces of the warriors returned marked by the experience, no longer with the glow of courage, but with the shadow of fear and sadness. Kechü, upon meeting his friend again, noticed the immediate change in Tepu. The war had begun to wear down not only their bodies, but also their spirits. Although they tried to return to normality, the distance between them became increasingly evident. "How are you feeling, Tepu?" Kechü asked with concern. Tepu looked at him in silence for a moment before answering. "Not as a hero, that's for sure. The battle was terrible, Kechü. Everything we imagined when we were children, and it's not like that. It's not like the stories told it." Kechü listened attentively, but he also knew that the war was far from over. His friend was not only struggling with enemies on the battlefield, but also with the internal conflict that war brought with it. The fighting continued, with rival tribes continuing to try to take control of Angami territory. The situation in the region was becoming increasingly chaotic. Amid this, tensions between the Kechü and Tepu families increased, reflecting the divisions within the tribe. Tepu's family, having suffered the loss of several close warriors, increasingly pushed for all young men, including those who had hitherto avoided combat, to take up arms. Kechü, although he had never been trained as a warrior, was called up. The pressure from his community caught up with him, and although he and his father continued to advocate peace, the reality of war surrounded them. One night, Kechü and Tepu found themselves in a secluded corner of the camp, far from the eyes and ears of others. The conversation they had both been avoiding became inevitable. "Kechü, you can't keep walking away from this," Tepu said, his voice gravelly. "The war is engulfing us all, whether we like it or not. I don't know how much longer I can protect you from the decisions our families are making." Kechü knew his friend was right. It was no longer just a matter of personal desires, but of survival. But something inside him refused to accept that reality. "What about our friendship, Tepu? We said we wouldn't let this tear us apart." Tepu looked at him sadly. "Our friendship is still the most important thing to me. But now we are on opposite sides. My family needs me in the war, and your family is still seeking a peace that seems impossible. I don't know how to resolve this, Kechü. I only know that conflict gives us no choice." That was the last sincere conversation they had for weeks. The war, which had been a distant thing, settled into both of their hearts, separating them. Tepu immersed himself more in his role as a warrior, while Kechü, pressured by his community, was torn between his peaceful principles and the growing demand that he join the fight. Finally, the most important battle came. The Angami tribe was called upon to defend their home in a direct confrontation against the rival tribe. It was a decisive fight, one that could determine the future of the warring tribes. Kechü, despite his inner resistance, was forced to join the ranks of the warriors. In his heart, he knew that his place was not on the battlefield, but pressure and duty to his family forced him to make a decision he never imagined. Now, like Tepu, he was immersed in a conflict from which he saw no way out. On the day of the battle, Kechü and Tepu met on the battlefield. Although they both knew they could not fight each other, circumstances had placed them on opposite sides. Amidst the chaos, their eyes met. Neither of them was willing to raise a sword against the other, but war was no friend, and soon the two found themselves embroiled in a brutal battle. The battlefield was a landscape devastated by the fury of war. The screams of warriors echoed in the air, accompanied by the sound of clashing metal and the wailing of the fallen. The dust raised by the movements of both armies enveloped the plain in a thick fog, while the gray sky seemed to mourn the tragedy unfolding below. Kechü, who had never been trained as a warrior, found himself disoriented in the midst of this chaos. All around him, the men of his tribe fought desperately, trying to defend what was left of their homes. Although he had been pushed into battle by the pressure of his community and duty to his family, his hands trembled as he held the sword he had been given. He felt the weight of the metal, not only on his body, but also on his spirit. This was not his place. He was not made to destroy, but to protect, and the violence around him made him question whether there was any hope for the future. Across the field, Tepu fought with the same fury and skill that his family had instilled in him since childhood. Unlike Kechü, Tepu moved confidently among the warriors, leading attacks and defending his tribe with a precision born of training and experience. Yet despite his prowess, his heart was divided. Every blow he struck, every enemy he felled, took him further from the person he wanted to be. As the fighting intensified, Tepu and Kechü found themselves in the thick of it. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, but in that instant, the noise of war seemed to fade away. They were not two warriors facing each other. They were friends, brothers in spirit, who had been swept up by forces neither of them wanted. Tepu, sword raised, hesitated for the first time since the battle had begun. He couldn't attack Kechü, and he knew Kechü felt the same. They both slowly lowered their weapons, ignoring the conflict around them for a brief moment of peace. "It can't be like this, Tepu," Kechü said, his voice shaking. "We promised each other that we wouldn't let war separate us." Tepu, breathing heavily, nodded. "I know, but what can we do now? The war is already here. We can't stop it alone." The chaos continued around them, but that brief exchange was enough to remind them of who they really were. They weren't enemies. They weren't warriors blinded by vengeance or greed. They were two friends who shared a bond stronger than any tribal conflict. At that moment of tension, a group of enemy warriors advanced towards Kechü. Tepu, without thinking twice, rushed to protect his friend, deflecting the attacks and covering him with his shield. "Come on, we have to get out of here," Tepu shouted, urging Kechü to follow him. Despite the chaos and danger, the two friends managed to temporarily escape the center of the battle, taking refuge on a small hill that gave a clear view of the field. From there, they observed the devastation that the war had brought to their tribes. The ground was stained with blood, and warriors from both sides fell without distinction. There were no heroes on that battlefield, only men facing their own destiny. Kechü, staring into space, spoke in a dull voice. This cannot continue. Tepu, if we continue fighting, we will both lose more than we could ever win." Tepu, breathing heavily, looked out over the field and nodded. "You're right. But how do we stop something that's already started?" At that moment, they both knew what they had to do. They couldn't change the past, but they could try to stop the coming destruction. Even though they knew it was dangerous, Kechü and Tepu decided to stand up to their own leaders and beg for a truce. "Let's talk to our elders," Tepu said determinedly. "We must try to stop this war, if only for ourselves." However, when they returned to their respective families, they were greeted with looks of distrust and disapproval. Tensions within their tribes were as high as on the battlefield. The idea of a truce seemed absurd to those who had lost family and friends in the war. When Tepu spoke to his father, a respected warrior, he was met with immediate resistance. "Call for a truce. Tepu, we have shed too much blood. The elders will not agree. Why would we want to talk to our enemies?" Tepu, full of frustration, replied, "If we don't, this war will destroy us all. This is not about winning or losing, father. It's about surviving, about preserving what's left." On the other hand, Kechü was also facing the same resistance. His father, although more inclined to peace, knew that convincing the tribal leaders to stop the conflict would be a near impossible task. "They won't listen easily, son. But if you really want it, you must be prepared to face a lot of opposition." Both friends knew they were fighting a battle harder than any other. The external war was fierce, but the internal war within their own tribes was just as devastating. The following days were a constant struggle. Kechü and Tepu, each on their own, tried to convince their leaders and families that a truce was the only viable option to avoid the complete annihilation of both sides. The conversations were tough, and many were reluctant to accept the possibility of making peace. The grievances and the pain of personal losses weighed too heavily on the decisions of the warriors and elders. Finally, in the midst of a meeting where the elders of the Angami tribe were debating whether to continue fighting or consider a truce, Kechü stood up and spoke in a clear, firm voice. "If we continue down this path, we will lose more than we gain," he said, looking at the exhausted faces of the warriors. "How many more must die before we understand that war is not the answer? Tepu and I face each other on the battlefield, but we do not raise our weapons against each other, not out of cowardice, but because we know there is something more important than victory. Our friendship, our humanity. It is time to stop fighting and start rebuilding." His words echoed through the hall, and though some warriors still harbored doubts, the seed of truce had been planted. Kechü's words had touched the deepest chords of some warriors and elders of the tribe, but not all shared his vision of a truce. The resentment accumulated over generations was difficult to erase in a single speech. Those who had lost loved ones in the war were not willing to forget so easily, much less reach out to their enemies. Meanwhile, in Tepu's tribe, the situation was equally tense. Some warriors viewed him with distrust, questioning his loyalty for having saved Kechü on the battlefield. His act of compassion, far from being celebrated, was seen as a sign of weakness. Tepu's father, a respected warrior leader, was torn between his love for his son and the pressure of those who demanded more blood. In both tribes, rumors began to spread. Kechü and Tepu were betraying their own people in the name of a friendship that no longer had a place in times of war. Tepu walked silently along the edge of the camp, away from the accusatory gazes of his fellow warriors. The conversation with his father had been hard. Despite the closeness he had always felt with him, the war was destroying even that bond. His father, A traditional man could not understand why Tepu refused to continue fighting as his ancestors had done. "What you did for Kechü has put us in a difficult position," his father told him the last time they spoke. "Many warriors think you have weakened, that you have forgotten which side you are on." Tepu, though hurt by those words, calmly replied, "Father, this is not about choosing a side. This is about stopping a war that is pointless. If we continue like this, there will be nothing left to fight for." Despite his speech, Tepu knew that the seeds of betrayal had already been planted. There were warriors in both tribes who were unwilling to allow his vision of peace to move forward, and watchful eyes were increasingly cast upon him and Kechü. In Kechü's tribe, the situation was not much better. The elders, although moved by his call for peace, were faced with the reality that their own warriors were divided. Some saw Kechü as an idealistic young man who did not understand the reality of war, while others were beginning to suspect that his friendship with Tepu had turned him into a traitor. One night, as Kechü tried to sleep, he was awakened by the sound of whispering in the darkness. Coming out of his hut, he found a small group of warriors, led by a man named Yuren, a veteran warrior who had lost his son in the first battle against Tepu's tribe. "What's going on here?" Kechü asked, observing the hostile gazes surrounding him. Yuren stepped forward, his face hardened with pain and fury. "We know what you're doing, Kechü. You're trying to save those damned enemies at the expense of our own. What makes you think they wouldn't do the same thing they did to my son?" Kechü stepped back, aware that the situation could quickly turn violent. "I'm not betraying anyone, Yuren. I just want to stop this war before more of our children die." Yuren clenched his fists. "Peace will not bring back my son, and it will not save those who have already fallen. It will only make us weaker." Before the situation could escalate, Kechü's father appeared and calmed the warriors, assuring them that the final decision on peace would rest with the Council of Elders. But mistrust had been sown, and Kechü knew that both he and Tepu were in danger not only from external enemies, but from those who were unwilling to accept peace. The next few days were a mix of fear and hope. While talks of a possible truce began to take shape on both sides, the more belligerent factions within the tribes were planning their own course of action. There was a group in Tepu's tribe who, unbeknownst to him, were planning an ambush against Kechü. These warriors, furious at the losses they had suffered, were convinced that eliminating Kechü would destroy any chance of peace and force the Angami to continue fighting. One evening, when Kechü was alone in the fields near the camp, Tepu's warriors carried out their ambush. They surrounded him, armed with spears and swords, ready to eliminate what they saw as the last obstacle to continuing the war. Kechü tried to talk, tried to reason with them, but their hatred clouded any possibility of understanding. Just as one of the warriors was preparing to launch his attack, a figure ran towards the group. Tepu appeared out of nowhere, standing between Kechü and the attackers. "Stop!" Tepu shouted, throwing out his arms to protect his friend. "If you attack him, you will not only betray our friendship, but you will condemn our tribes to more death and suffering." The warriors hesitated for a moment, surprised by Tepu's appearance. But one of them, blinded by hatred, launched an attack. Tepu, in an instinctive act, deflected the blow, but the spear reached him, wounding him in the side. Kechü shouted his friend's name as Tepu fell to the ground. The warriors, stunned by what they had done, quickly retreated, fearing the repercussions of their actions. Kechü knelt beside Tepu, who was breathing heavily but with a smile on his lips. "I told you I wouldn't let this separate us," Tepu said weakly. Kechü, with tears in his eyes, pressed on his friend's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You shouldn't have risked your life for me." "I did it because I knew you would have done the same," Tepu replied. Tepu's sacrifice did not go unnoticed. Warriors from both tribes, upon hearing of the incident, gathered together to discuss what had happened. The sight of Tepu, a warrior from his own tribe, risking his life to protect someone from the enemy tribe, changed the perspectives of many. Tepu's heroic act and his determination to protect his friend had a profound impact on both sides of the conflict. The elders of both tribes, finally moved by the story of friendship between Kechü and Tepu, decided to meet to discuss a truce. Tepu's personal sacrifice, more than any words, showed that there was something more important than war: unity and shared humanity. Although Tepu's wound was severe, he survived, and both he and Kechü became symbols of hope and reconciliation. News of Tepu's sacrifice quickly spread through both tribes, becoming the turning point that many had been waiting for. Warriors who until then had clamored for more blood began to question whether the war was really worth it. The elders, witnesses of the losses and suffering that the war had brought, called a joint council between the tribes, something that had not been done in generations. Kechü, his heart still pounding from his friend's sacrifice, stood next to Tepu, who was still recovering from his wound. They both knew that this was the crucial moment, the last chance to stop the war before it caused more destruction. The council met under the sacred tree on the plain, where the two tribes were facing each other in an attempt at reconciliation. The elders, seated in a semicircle, listened attentively as Kechü and Tepu addressed the assembly. "We have fought on the battlefield. We have seen death up close," Tepu began, his voice firm though still weak from his wound. "But what has sustained us all this time is something stronger than the sword. It is our friendship, a connection that war could not destroy. If Kechü and I, being from different families and tribes, could stay together, then our tribes can also find peace." Kechü spoke up, his eyes filled with hope. "The war has brought us nothing but loss. My friend and I have seen enough lives ruined. If we continue down this path, there will be no tribe to protect, no future to build. We must find a way to stop this violence." The elders murmured among themselves, some still reluctant to accept the truce. However, Tepu's sacrifice and Kechü's eloquence had planted a seed of doubt in those who had previously opposed peace. After long deliberations, the elders made a decision. They would call a meeting with the leaders of both tribes to discuss an official truce. For the first time in a long time, there was a real chance for peace. Although the elders' decision marked a significant step forward, not everyone agreed. On both sides, there were warriors who still did not trust the truce and who regarded Kechü and Tepu as symbols of betrayal. They knew that if they did not do something soon, the peace talks could succeed, and with it, any chance for revenge would be lost. A small faction of radical warriors from the rival tribe, unable to accept the possibility of a truce, began planning an attack during the talks. Their aim was clear: to disrupt the negotiations and provoke a new round of fighting that would eliminate any chance of peace. Kechü and Tepu, aware of the tensions that still remained, decided to take additional measures to ensure the safety of the meeting. They knew that if the attack went ahead, all the peace they had dreamed of would crumble. "This will be our last effort," Tepu said as they inspected security preparations. "We cannot allow those who refuse to change to destroy what we have built." The night before the Grand Council, Kechü and Tepu organized extra patrols and made sure that the warriors most loyal to peace were prepared for any eventuality. Both knew that violence could break out at any moment, but they were determined not to back down. The day of negotiations arrived, and the tribes gathered on a large open space where the leaders sat face to face for the first time in years. Kechü and Tepu watched attentively, hoping that the situation would remain calm. However, just as the talks were beginning to take a positive turn, the rebel warriors launched their attack. Arrows flew from nearby trees, and chaos broke out between the tribes. But Tepu and Kechü, anticipating this move, had already prepared their warriors to protect the council. The men loyal to peace managed to hold off the attackers, defending the leaders and preventing the violence from spreading. In the midst of the confusion, Tepu was wounded again, this time defending himself from a direct attack. Kechü, filled with rage at seeing his friend fall again, fought with all his might to protect him. The confrontation was intense, but the peace warriors managed to stop the attack and disarm the aggressors. Tepu's sacrifice once again marked a profound change in the hearts of both sides. Seeing that Kechü and Tepu were willing to give their lives for peace, even in the face of those who sought to destroy it, the leaders of both tribes finally understood the importance of their friendship. Following the failed attack, tensions finally began to ease. Tepu's heroic act, coupled with Kechü's firm determination to protect the truce, was enough for the leaders of both tribes to come to an agreement. peace negotiations resumed, this time without interruption. Days later, both tribes signed a truce agreement at the same place where the battles had taken place. It was a historic moment for both cultures, and although there was still a long way to go in the process of reconciliation, the first step towards peace had been taken. Kechü and Tepu were celebrated as symbols of unity and bravery, not only for their ability to fight on the battlefield, but for their courage in defying the hatred that had dominated their lands for generations. Warriors who had previously doubted the truce began to understand that peace was not a sign of weakness but of wisdom. The tribes, who had lived in fear and mistrust for years, slowly began to rebuild their relationships. As the years passed, Kechü and Tepu's friendship became a legend. Their names were told in stories around the fire, and their sacrifice was remembered by younger generations as an example of what could be achieved when the common good was put before violence. Over time, Tepu's physical wounds healed, but the emotional scars of the war remained with both friends. However, they found solace in knowing that their struggle had not been in vain. Peace had come, and the unity they had long dreamed of was now part of their tribe's legacy. In a final scene many years later, Kechü and Tepu, now old, sat under the great tree where they had spent so many moments of their youth. Around them, children played freely, unaware that those lands had once been the scene of bloody battles. "We did it, brother," Kechü said, looking at Tepu with a smile. "Yes," Tepu replied, "but it was because we never let the war change us." The two friends remained silent for a moment, enjoying the peace they had worked so hard to obtain. They knew that their legacy would live on forever in the stories that would be told about their friendship and their fight for peace.